And I was saying, so, yeah, so during my PhD, I was working on the drought experiment that is up in the north of Queensland in Australia. So I've been looking at the impact of drought on insect communities in tropical rainforests. Yeah, so first, just a few words about drought. So drought is something that is a bit harder to predict compared to climate models and temperature, because there are a lot of different factors that can influence precipitation compared to things like temperature. But overall, what most climate models seem to predict is that we have a lot of areas around the world but we go through very heavy droughts. So this slide is just an example of one climate model projection. But what we can see is that you have areas both in temperate parts of the world and also in tropical parts of the world that we go through more and more heavy droughts. And so, yes, we have lots of tropical forests like in South America or in Australia that might be impacted by droughts. So yeah, so hold on, can you actually see the slide? You can see all the slides, all the side of the slide, or do you see my, yeah?
I can see everything, I believe.
Yeah, just checking. All right, so yeah, so first, what would be the effect of drought on trees? So you have a lot of very simple, easy to predict direct effects of drought on trees. So obviously when you have a drought, you tend to have a reduced plant growth and you have things that happen such as leaf loss, or you have less seedling production, things like that. And then if the drought is very severe, you can have some tree death. And then in some cases, you can even have, if the drought is very intense, you can have some wildfires, which will obviously lead to tree death as well. So this is a kind of easy to predict effect of drought on trees. But then you also have a lot of indirect effect of drought on the trees. And one of these indirect effects would be via insects. So what we might expect to happen with insects is that first we have some changes in plants, and those changes in the plants will induce some changes in the insect communities, which will then in turn also affect the plants back, because insects have such important roles in forests. For example, the majority of herbivore damage in the tropics is carried out by insects rather than vertebrates or larger animals. They're also very important for things like decomposition. They're a huge part of the food web. So they have this huge important role, and so they can have a lot of effects on the trees following droughts. And so understanding what will happen with insects is really key to understand plant health in the context of climate change and droughts. So what do we know at this point about the effect of droughts on plants via insects? Well, we already bits with some data we have in temperate forests. So what has been happening in a lot of temperate forests in Europe and in North America is that you will have, following long droughts, trees would have weaker plant defenses. And so normally trees, they have a range of chemical defenses which can protect themselves against insect attacks. So they have chemicals that are either toxic to insects or just unpalatable. Sometimes they even have some chemicals that can attract some predators that will then eat the insects. But when there is a drought, trees tend to not produce as much of those chemicals because they don't have as much resources to put into producing those defenses. So it's then an opportunity for insects to attack the trees, and something that has been seen a lot in temperate forests. So, for example, you have a mountain pine beetle that has been responsible for killing millions of trees in temperate forests. So that's something we know about temperate forests. But yeah, then there's a question of what about rainforests? There's not as much data about what's happening with droughts in rainforest because but mostly because it's kind of a newer phenomenon. Like it's not something that has been observed a lot. This kind of very heavy drought in rainforest is something that has been a bit more recent. But yeah, it's something that is a bit worrying because we have not seen before this kind of wildfires like there has been a couple of years ago in some part of forest in Australia, which usually are very humid, and just the impact of drought in general is not something that is very well known. And so here comes the drought experiments. So there's been a few people that have started to look at what's happening with drought in rainforests. So I'm pretty sure the first drought experiment was one that was set up in South America. So the photos here of the drought experiment that I was working on. So that one was in Australia. And as you can see on the photos, the drought experiment was consisting of some clear plastic panels that were set up above a large area of rainforests. And so the plastic panels would prevent the rain from falling on the ground. And so you would still have a bit of water that managed to reach the ground, but the soil humidity data was showing that there was about 60% roughly of rainfall that was prevented from reaching the ground. So it was kind of a good simulation of what increased drought will look like probably in the next few decades. Some of my study sites, so there was about half a hectare of rainforest that was covered by these drought experiments that you've seen in the slide just before. And then just next to it, there was a control plot. So the study site was a study site that we know very, very well because it had been studied for dozens of years before the drought experiment started. So we knew that the tree species, the tree heights, and everything was fairly similar between the drought and control plots, so they were quite good to compare. And a very exciting thing about the study site was that there was a canopy crane which was situated in the middle between the drought plot and the control plots. So you could really access the top of the trees, the canopy, and collect insects there, which was a really interesting thing to do. First, because the insect community is really different at the canopy and at the ground. So I was quite interested to see if drought would affect them differently. And also we were kind of expecting different effects of drought on larger trees and on the smaller trees, because that's what previous drought experiments have been showing. So I was just curious to see how large trees and insects living on the large trees would compare to the insects living on the smaller trees in terms of drought effect. All right, so in terms of hypothesis, so my main hypothesis was that I would find really different effects of a drought depending on the feeding yield. And the reason for that is that, so you have some things that happen on the scale of the whole tree, like I said previously, a decrease in plant defenses, which would be something positive for a lot of insects. But then if you look at what's happening with different parts of the plants, so if you look at the leaves and the insects that will feed on the leaves, like leaf chewers and sapsuckers. So with drought, we do expect things like tougher leaves and also just leaf loss and less leaf for insects to eat. So we expect leaf chewers and sapsuckers to not do as well with drought. But then if you look at other things like wood borers and insects that would eat dead wood, you do expect that with drought you would have a bit more dead wood, so maybe wood borers would do a bit better. Fungi, I was not 100% sure with that one, but you do tend to have a bit more fungi going on the dead wood actually, so I was expecting maybe more fungivores. So different responses for different feeding yields. So that's a kind of summary of what I was expecting for different feeding yields. And then there were also some yields that, like saprophages, predators, that didn't really know what would happen with them. And then, as I said previously, I was also expecting different effect of droughts in the canopy and in the ground. All right, so in terms of my sampling, so I was sampling so about 100 trees in total, so half of them being in the canopy and half of them more at ground level, and obviously half being at the drought plot and half in the control plot. I sampled every couple of months for 2 years. And so my method of sampling, I was just beating leaves with a stick and just collecting any insects that were falling off the branches in a tray. And then back in the lab, I was sorting them. And so I sorted over insect to feeding guilds. And then I also sorted the beetles and ants to species because I wanted to do a bit more of a species diversity analysis. Yeah. All right, and so in terms of the results that we found, so as expected, drought was affecting insect abundance differently depending on feeding guild. And one very interesting thing that I found was that basically at most of the effect of a drought was happening mostly at the ground level, the seedlings. So at the ground level, there was virtually almost every feeding guild that was significantly affected by droughts. So some would do better, some would do worse, but almost every feeding guild had a significant effect of drought on them. Whereas other canopy was not that much thing happening. So there was a bit fewer fungivore. And I also did find lower beetle species richness. But yeah, that was about it. So in terms of how my results for the insect abundance was compared to my hypothesis. So at the ground, it was fairly similar to what my hypothesis were. So I was expecting more wood borers and more fungivores because of over increase in deadwood. The interesting difference though was for sapsuckers. I thought that there would be less sapsuckers at the drought because I was thinking that with a drought and with a tougher leaf and with a leaf loss, you would just tend to have a lot less leaf throwers and sapsuckers, but sapsuckers seem to be doing quite well with droughts. So that was possibly because of an increase in plant defenses. And then, yeah, at the canopy, as I said previously, it was just basically most of the feeding guild was no significant effect of a drought on them. Another thing I looked at was the community composition, and I did that for ants and beetles. Again, at the canopy, there was not that much difference between the control plot and the drought plot, but there was a bit more difference in the community at the ground, both for ants and beetles. Yeah, so after all the results I said before, I thought, okay, it seems like the big trees at the canopy seem to not be that much impacted by drought. And also some of the plant data that we were having on the sap flow in trees were indicating that bigger trees seem to be doing fine with drought, at least for the first few years of the experiment. But the one result I found where there was a big effect of the drought was when I was looking a bit more at insect seasonality. So normally, what you have in the control condition is that most insects will be highly seasonal. So you have most feeding guilds that have a huge peak in abundance just before the wet season. And so that was what I was seeing at the control. But when I was looking at the drought plots at the canopy, almost every insect feeding guild lost their seasonality. So they were all aseasonal and there was no huge peak in abundance before the wet season. And that was true at the canopy, but at the ground, there was still a bit of seasonality observed. So yeah, for some reason, at the canopy, the large trees, there seemed to be this loss of seasonality and loss of the peak of abundance of insects just before the wet season. Yeah, and then another thing I wanted to look a bit more at during my PhD, I wanted to look a bit more at wood borers because so when I was sampling my insects, the method I was using, which was beating leaves, is not the best method to actually capture wood borers because wood borers obviously live inside the bark and the wood of trees. So I did a tree health survey. So I surveyed about 2,000 trees. I think it was about 3 years after the start of a drought experiment. And I was basically looking for any sign of wood boring. So you can look for wood boring holes. You have some kind of cracks through the bark. I was looking for termites, any sign of wood boring I could find. And yeah, and so what I did find was a bigger proportion of wood boring damage on the drought plot compared to the control plot. There was also more termite activity. And again, the small trees seem to be more affected by drought than the large trees. So actually there was no significant differences for the bigger trees in terms of wood boring damage. But yeah, for the small trees, so less than 10 centimeter dBH, there was a lot more trees that were attacked by wood borers. So yeah, so overall, I find that yeah, insects living on small trees near the ground seem to be a lot more heavily affected by droughts than the canopy insects. So that was if I was looking at the insect abundance, community composition, but there are also some effect of droughts at the canopy. And so, yeah, so the responses were really different depending on feeding yields. So you can't really have an easy answer as to what's happening with droughts and insects. When I was doing my literature review, there was a lot of literature that was talking about the very, very large outbreaks that you have following drought. So following drought, you have these huge insect outbreaks of some wood borers and things like that, but it's only part of the picture and part of what is happening. So it's very important to look at different feeding yields to understand a bit better at what's happening. And then also another reason why it's important to look at different feeding yields is that you have some insects like wood borers and sapsuckers that can really have a lot of effects on tree health. And that's something that I would be really curious to look a bit more at it long term. And actually, I'm going to look at it a bit more during my postdoc now, because all the results I presented during this talk, they were from data I collected from 1 year after the start of experiments until three years after the start of experiment. So it was relatively short term compared to the long-term effect that you can have of drought on trees. And there's a lot of data from South America that tend to indicate that you can have a lot more drought effects on larger trees after a lot more years. So I would be quite interested to see if the trend I was seeing where mostly small trees were impacted, but not that much bigger trees, would still carry on after a few more years. All right.
Okay, thank you very much for a nice presentation. I will stop the recording.